Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. Can I please ask everyone in the public gallery to switch off or turn your devices to silent so they don't affect the committee's work this morning? Item number 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 4 and 5 in private this morning? Thank you. Item number 2 is post-legislative scrutiny, the Freedom of Information Scotland Act 2002. I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for coming to the committee's meeting this morning. This is the first oral evidence session that the committee is holding as part of its scrutiny of the Act. The evidence session will take place in a roundtable format with the aim of encouraging discussion. As usual, MSPs will ask questions from witnesses, but witnesses can also ask questions of each other. However, we still want to retain some structure to this discussion, so please indicate to me or to the clerks, Lucy or Alan, if you would like to contribute. And when you speak, your microphone will be activated automatically, so there is no need to touch your console. I intend to structure the discussion around the 4 themes which were in the committee paper, and I will indicate when we are moving on to the next theme. At the end of the discussion of the 4 themes, there will be an opportunity for witnesses to highlight any other issues that they would like the committee to consider. I'm going to ask MSPs and witnesses to briefly introduce themselves before we begin. So my name is Jenny Mara. I am convener of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee.
I'm Craig DL, Head of Policy and Research at the think tank Commonweal.
Liam Kerr, MSP for North East Region and Deputy Convener of this committee.
Bailey Robb, the Member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Cowdenbeath and the Trustee for Policy and Advocacy.
Alec Neil, MSP for Airdrie Shotts.
Carol Ewart, the Convener of the Campaign for Freedom of Information in Scotland.
Anas Sarwar, MSP for the Glasgow region.
Severin Carell, the Scotland Editor of The Guardian.
Nick McGowan-Lowe, Organiser for the National Union of Journalists.
Colin Beattie, MSP for Midlothian North and Musselburgh.
Rob Edwards, a Director of the journalist cooperative The Ferret.
I'm Willie Coffey, MSP for Kilmarnock and Irvine Valley.
Claire Cairns, Network Coordinator for the Coalition of Carers in Scotland.
Bill Bowman, MSP for North East Scotland.
Stephen Lowe, Policy Officer, Unison Scotland.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to kick off this morning because before we start the discussion on the 4 themes, I'd like to get a sense from witnesses briefly as to whether the Freedom of Information, the 2002 Act, has delivered its policy objectives. Has it made public bodies more open and transparent as it was designed to do? Can I invite brief opening comments from our witnesses on that question? Carol.
Undoubtedly, the message that FOI law sends out will result in more openness and transparency. However, when the legislation was designed, and I can be honest and say I was around at that time, we were involved at the very early stages and all through the passage of the legislation. The legislation is designed to work on 2 bases. First of all, making an FOI request, so forcing an organisation to be transparent and accountable, but proactive disclosure of information, which was supposed to be progressive. And that's the element that I think has really failed to realise its potential. There are important problems around regression on what was previously published is no longer published. There is regression around minute-taking and publication of agendas. So, yes, it has led to greater transparency and openness, but the pressure seems to be on individuals making requests for information rather than us being able to evaluate huge more amounts of information being actually published proactively of the kind that the public want to see.
Okay. So you're saying that it has increased transparency, but there's a number of issues which we're going to address this morning. Yes. Thank you very much. Any of our other witnesses? Stephen Lowe.
Yes, the Act has delivered up to a point. However, that point is going backwards. When the Act came into force, we had a mosaic of public services. What we now have is a kaleidoscope, and the Act is not sufficient to sustain transparency in that rapidly changing environment. What we have is a double standard, whereas what we need is a single principle.
A double standard in what way?
Well, if a service is being directly delivered by a public body, then FOI can be applied usefully at times. When the service has been outsourced to a private company or a third sector body, then you're putting yourself beyond that accountability through FOI, and that's amounting to billions of pounds that is effectively being transferred from accountability and transparency to a much more opaque.
Okay, and I think we'll probably get into more detail on that in a bit. Severin Carroll from The Guardian.
So just to clarify one point, myself and Rob Edwards are here as representatives of the 42 journalists that signed our joint submission. So our task here primarily is to speak to that agreed submission and the evidence that we supplied alongside it. The one thing I think we would say is that FOI remains what it was designed to be, which is a universal service, which ought to be free for all, and there ought to be equal access for all. And one of the problems that we encounter is that the notion of it being a universal service, open and free to all, is being undermined, is being harmed by some of the problems that we've identified in the submission that we made. And I think on some respects I, as an individual journalist, would endorse the comments, some of the comments being made by Carol and Stephen about some of the deficiencies and the fact that the multiplicity of public agencies or bodies in the private sector that have public sector roles is becoming quite a significant part of the problem. But we also think there are a couple of key issues about the public bodies who were given, or the organisations in the public realm that were given exemptions by the original Act that we ought to consider as well, namely and specifically the Crown Office in Scotland and the Royal Household as well.
Thank you. Anyone else on this opening point? Bailey Lee Robb, I believe you were. Bailey Lee Robb now.
So young people, in terms of the Act when it was passed, have now been able to access information that they might not have been before. So through that, the Act is working for young people, but obviously improvements can be made. So such as that only 25% of young people are aware that freedom of information is there for them. So things like that need to be addressed.
Okay, thank you very much. Craig Dalzell.
Yeah. Really to echo and amplify Carol and Stephen's points, because it's the essence of our own submission as well, that freedom of information, you can imagine the time before it and how opaque things were then, and it certainly has been an improvement, but it does need to go further. We do need to extend it to places like the Crown Office, places like private sector who are using public money. They need to be under the same scrutiny as public bodies using public money. And there is the fundamental limit to the current FOI system, that in order to get information, you have to be able to voice the question to get the answer. If you're not able to voice that question, if, for example, you're not aware of a contract out there, you can't ask questions about that contract. So we would like what we've called a glass wall approach to freedom of information, where basically there is a maximum level of proactive disclosure. Anything that would ordinarily be released under an FOI should just be proactively released.
Yes, that was certainly some evidence we heard before. Rob Edwards.
Just to add very briefly to what my colleague Sev said and others, and to add my endorsement to most of what's been said already. Yes, the freedom of information regime introduced in 2005, when I was also around, has made a huge improvement, has made for much more openness and transparency. But one of our main concerns is that now, years on, there are concerns that the Act is being sidestepped by people not recording information, which refers to one of the topics you were mentioning. And if, it's the case that there are parallel systems of making decisions by public bodies that are designed to avoid FOI by not being recorded or only being conducted informally or minutes not being taken, those issues, that to us is a real concern that needs addressing.
Great. Okay, and that's theme 3 that we're going to come on to as well. Let me start then. Nick McGowan-Lowe.
Thank you. It is good to, many of my colleagues around the table are in rough agreement, so I'll be brief. Freedom of information has set a high standard for a culture of openness and transparency. Clearly that has set out a high standard, but what we are seeing is that there are clear problems with how that's being implemented and a desire by some organisations to test the limits of that. Decisions are being made in a way which takes them out of the public eye, and public money is being moved out of a way where it's out of public scrutiny. In addition, from some of the submissions that I've seen from organisations that handle freedom of information requests, there does seem to be a culture that is creeping in that see journalistic requests as some kind of annoying fly to be battered away, rather than something that's in keeping with openness, transparency and accountability of public bodies.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. From the National Union of Journalists. Theme 1, colleagues, is making a request for information, and some of you have already touched upon this. We have a couple of questions on this, but can I ask witnesses to start off with any specific issues you have around the process of making a request for information? Claire Cairns.
Thank you. Our submission was really about the FOI requests that we submitted to all local authorities in October and November of last year. And sort of to take you through the process, I can tell you the issues along the way, if you like, that we encountered. The first was identifying where to send the information to. So we were doing bespoke information, which meant we had to send individually to each local authority area. So first of all, we had to identify where to send the information. And one of the issues around that was we were asking for information about CARES Act funding. Now, that funding was routed in one instance through the local authority to the Health and Social Care Partnership, and another way from the Health Board to the Health and Social Care Partnership. So the difficulty was that in many areas, although we went through the local authority came back and said, actually, that is not information that is pertaining to us, it's pertaining to the Health and Social Care Partnership. So in 4 areas that happened. And in one area, they said, OK, it needs to go to the Health Board. We went to the Health Board and they said, well, no, it's not us either. So I had to go back and insist on getting contact within the Health and Social Care Partnership. And I think that's something which is likely to happen, increasingly, because a lot of information does pertain to partnerships. And the difficulty is, I think, mostly whenever you're looking for the information of where to send your FOI to, it is always the local authority where you have the contact if you're just looking at on websites. So I think that really needs to be nailed down in terms of whose responsibility it is and making sure that information is clear for people. The second issue we had was around timescales. In terms of the information we got back, 14 requests were received late. So 7 requests were 5 to 7 weeks, 2 requests were 7 to 9 weeks, 2 requests were 9 to 11 weeks, and 3 requests were 11 to 13 weeks, and 3 we had no response from. We didn't chase up the no respondents or complain about it because we were on a deadline ourselves. We're quite a small organisation and we didn't have time to follow that through. So those 3 have been left as they are. And then when we received the information, although our questions I felt were quite clear in what we were asking for, a large number were incomplete, or the responses were very brief or very vague, or in some cases we believe inaccurate. So overall, we did get a lot of information from the FOI. I'm not saying it was a very useful exercise for us, and it was really the only way to find out how the money received to implement the CARES Act had actually been implemented and spent at a local level. But there were a lot of holes in that information, I would say. And for example, just to give you 1 or 2 responses we received, to give you an idea. So from one area, they said the only response we got was £80,000 was given to the local carer centre to provide care support, but the allocated amount to that area was £413,000. So there was no explanation of what happened to the rest of that allocation. And there were a lot of responses like that where we were given partial information, or sometimes we felt information that wasn't entirely accurate.
It's quite a fascinating case study, Claire, because your organisation, the Coalition of Carers, would expect some sort of consistency across the country because the policies across the country are the same. But it sounds as if you were getting different information and being directed in lots of different places.
Yes, I think so. And it goes back to the initial points made at the beginning that that information should have been publicly available. We shouldn't have had to have an FOI in the first place. Probably in terms of the information we received, a lot of it probably would have come from IJB minutes. Now, some of them may have been available on websites, but they're quite deep into websites, and we would have had to read through 6 months' worth of IJB minutes to find out at what point did they discuss it, what did they minute from it, because sometimes the minutes are extremely brief and don't go into detail, whereas what we should have publicly available is information from every area about what their spend is in relation to things like care support.
Thank you very much. Carol Ewart.
I just want to record that I consider that a matter of huge public interest, and I would agree that some of the submissions were kind of indicating that FOI was being abused by people asking vexatiously or odd questions. But we're talking about a really substantial issue of public interest, and I agree the information should have been proactively published. And what you're saying confirms what lots of people tell us, but it's very difficult to actually capture that. So it's great that you were able to do that. In terms of our experience of making a request, it used to be very simple to make an FOI request. When the law became effective on the 1st of January 2005, you could go onto the websites of the designated organisations and you could just click on the button and you could make an FOI request. And now a number of hurdles have been put in the way. First of all, it's not so easy to find out where you send an FOI request. When we have recently made one, we had to open up an account with a local authority on their online portal in order to make the FOI request. We have to, on occasion, fill out a pro forma, which means then that you don't have a copy of the request that you've submitted. In terms of who to send your FOI request to, that has become unduly complicated, and it's because it's more complicated now who is delivering services of a public nature or public services. I repeat again, we have a problem with arm's length external organisations. Audit Scotland is unable to tell us how many there actually are in Scotland. Its report of a few years ago advised that there were 34 major ones. We also know that under Section 6 of FOISA, publicly owned companies are automatically designated. There is no list of publicly owned companies, despite the fact that under the Model Publication Scheme, that information should be proactively published.
Carol, we're just going to come on to the issue, because Anas Sarwar has a question on that regarding private companies and the functions that they carry out, and are they capturable under FOI, a point that Stephen Lowe raised. But you said there that it has become more complicated to put in an FOI request. I mean, you are from the Campaign for Freedom of Information. Do you think that's intentional by public bodies to limit the number of freedom of information requests that are coming into them?
Absolutely. We do believe it's deliberately designed to put people off making FOI requests, because the simple process was one that was used initially, and now it's become much more complicated. And yet the whole point of so many public initiatives just now is to make accessing services simpler, and also the unification of services across local authorities, for example. So in one of the submissions it was suggested that there should just be one website that you go to and it gives you the FOI link to all the designated bodies so that you can easily access the information. It shouldn't be complicated. And you know, a number of the complaints from designated bodies was the imprecise nature of the FOI requests that they receive. It's much more difficult now to make an FOI request because public services are so much more complicated. So that undoubtedly makes it more difficult for the public to understand what kind of questions they should be asking.
Thank you very much,
to whom
Carol.
they're directing them.
Thank you. Severin Carroll.
So, in a piece of supplementary evidence as a case study, since we're on the theme about local authorities in particular being quite difficult to access, but also using quite different standards and tests, even though arguably they should be using exactly the same model. This is from a colleague who contacted me a couple of weeks ago after this committee session was publicised, and he said to us that East Lothian Council blocked an FOI which I had submitted to every other council, and they'd responded to this with no fuss. But West Lothian attempted to charge for 1 hour of work, saying that it was unfair that councils had to fund our research. So this journalist appealed and was given an answer eventually, but he's saying that he's worried about authorities seeing FOI as a free research tool rather than as a basic universal right, and a statutory right, of course, which is what FOISA actually sets it out as being. And he's also concerned that this is an example of journalists and FOI applicants being used as a kind of a weapon in a war between councils and government about funding. So that's just an additional example of the kind of experiences that we have on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Severin. Anas Sarwar.
I'm struck by Carol's comments around there's no publicly available list of the ALIOs, either list of the names or the total number, or indeed of publicly owned companies, and by both Stephen and Seb's comments around those that aren't currently covered by the FOI legislation. Can you give us some practical examples of some areas that are private companies or third sector organisations that are delivering those public sector delivery arms and getting public money that should be covered?
Sure.
You mentioned a couple already, Seb. I don't know if Stephen wants to pitch in more.
Stephen Lowe, Unison.
Yep. If you look at Glasgow, Glasgow's IT services, ICT services used to be delivered in-house, then they were delivered by an ALIO, and then a few years back, 3 or 4 years back, the council privatised their IT service. So you have a company, Canadian, called CGI, who have an £800 million contract to deliver ICT services for 12 years. You can stick the term FOI into CGI's website, you don't get anywhere because they're beyond that. So that's £800 million worth of public money that is not interrogable for FOI purposes, that would be where even if you still had an ALIO, far less when you had the service delivered directly by the council. Another one is selected purchases of social care. That's currently a £304 million contract running over, I think it's 4 years, for Glasgow City Council. Now that is split up between just under 40 organisations, and going down the list, there's a handful of them that you could put an FOI request into, but the vast bulk of them you couldn't because they're third sector or commercial. So again, that's £304 million worth of public money delivering the most intimate of services that is taken out with that level of public scrutiny.
Just to add to that, I mean, one of the things that particularly concerns us at the Ferret and journalistic colleagues are the hubcos set up under the Scottish Futures Trust, which, you know, are responsible for building lots of public services, schools, hospitals and so forth around the country. They're exempt from FOI and yet they're spending vast sums of public money to provide public services. And you know, from a journalistic point of view, that's certainly very frustrating. The same applies to the Improvement Service, the government organisation, and rather bizarrely, the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities isn't subject to FOI. Maybe it should be.
Yes, I wasn't aware of that. It's very interesting. Bailey Lee Robb.
So, according to research, an Ipsos Mori poll from last year, despite local authorities having a legal obligation to respond to freedom of information requests, only 28% of young people were confident that they would actually get a response. The same survey showed that 38% of young people felt public bodies are more likely to respond to requests from adults than young people. And so when we look at it as a whole, the freedom of information awareness and confidence is very low for young people. So and that is because they feel that the process is too complicated to carry out, just as Carol has said and others around the table. They also feel that they're not going to be taken seriously. They feel like they're a pain in the backside for local authorities, and that's how they feel that they're going to be treated. They also don't actually understand it because they're not educated on it. We need to turn now and educate our young people so they know that they've got that information at their fingertips, that they can request that, they can get that information. They also feel that the local authority will just kick the can down the road. You know, they'll use that 20 days and then come back to them with a question, and the clock starts ticking again. So that's just briefly how young people are viewing freedom of information.
Experience isn't unique to young people.
No.
So they do that to me as well. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Bailey Lee. Anas.
It's universally agreed that any private organisation, third sector organisation, or any organisation that is receiving public funds should be open to the FOI legislation. I presume there's universal agreement on that.
Yes.
If you're delivering public services, then you should be. I mean, I think that, there's a limit to how much you. If the council, if you're selling paper clips to the council, there's a limit to how much FOI should. But if you're taking money for delivering services, that's a very, very different thing. And that there should be a single principle. A service is being delivered by public money, whether that's being done by the council, by the health board, or by Carillion or one of these other outfits. The same standard should apply, and it doesn't currently.
Rob, sorry, can I put Anas's question to you as well? Because you mentioned a number of organisations. Would you like to see them fall under the gambit of the Act too?
Yes.
Thank you. I've got Severin Carroll, then Craig Dalzell, and then Alec Neil.
I think one of the salient points about this topic is that you have a lot of privatisation of delivering of public services, particularly through the Scottish Futures Trust model, when you are dealing with secondary schools that are or hospitals run and operated as PFI projects for 25 years, where you have companies that are making a significant amount of profit as a consequence of providing core services such as maintenance or janitorial services and so on and so forth being excluded. And one of the interesting questions that emerges when we start to investigate this is that the Scottish Information Commission has actually upheld these defences by the local authorities or public bodies using these companies, that these are commercial in competence contracts. And there is a problem that we think, and I think other people that have made submissions to the committee have raised this too, that this itself becomes a significant problem because they are delivering public goods and public benefits and public services. And the point at which the commercial interest becomes seen as superior to the public interest has got to be tested. And people have to be much more alive to what the purpose of these services actually are. They're not for the public, for the private company, they're for the public sector.
Thank you very much. Craig Dalzell.
I'm willing to accept a certain level of pragmatism in that it's maybe not entirely fair to say a hypothetical example of a large multinational IT services company that serves to many different governments plus the Scottish Government or Scottish local authorities. Maybe freedom of information shouldn't apply to the entire company, but it should certainly be the case that we should be able to use freedom of information to track where our money is being spent and how it's being spent.
Okay. Alec Neil.
I just want to go back to clarify something that Stephen said when he made this distinction between delivering a public service and buying in. The example you used was paperclips. I just want to be clear. It's not just about delivering public services, but also supplying products. So if you look at the whole procurement business, then anyone who has a contract with a public agency or a public company or a government department, that information should be publicly available.
The contracting procedure should be fully available. The distinction I was making, it just so happened because I was looking down the list of Glasgow's contracts. I've seen that there's, they get their milk from Wiseman's dairies. I mean, to be frank, I'm more interested in being able to interrogate the care services contracts than,
I understand that, Stephen, but you are, but the competitor to Wiseman, who may feel, you know, that they may be, so surely they're as entitled to that information as you are entitled to what you're interested in.
Quite possibly. It's just sort of less of my concern, although I did see from the submissions that Glasgow City Council are saying that they get a lot of FOI requests from commercial entities, to which I think, well, if you're putting so much of your services out into the marketplace, you've got to expect people to seek market information, and perhaps a way around this would be delivering more services in-house and for public good rather than private profit. But that's very much a unison point of view.
Okay. Any further points on this? Craig Dale.
Yeah, just very quickly on the commercial interest side of things, if a private company wants to get involved in public spending and the price of that is opening up their boots to freedom of information, and another competitor, you know, further down the tendering process wants to come in and uses that information, well, they'll be under the same the same conditions if and when they get it. So I'm fine with that.
Carol Urt.
I just also wanted to add into the conversation the duty to comply with human rights law. And the Human Rights Act 1998 requires everyone who is delivering public services or services of a public nature to comply with the European Convention on Human Rights. And Article 10 is the right to form an opinion by receiving and imparting information. And the famous case of Magyar was decided at the European Court of Human Rights as equating to the right to access information. And in our submission, we pointed out that NGOs, blogists and journalists have an elevated right because they are acting in the public interest. And I say that because I think it's relevant to this conversation, because we're talking about when services are delivered of a public nature, then those organisations should be covered by the Human Rights Act. So if a voluntary organisation is delivering services of a public nature, or a private organisation is delivering services of a public nature, they should be open to scrutiny by providing information, and it allows us then to form an opinion as to whether or not we're getting value for money, the service is fit for purpose, and so on. So I think we need to be mindful that there are several regimes that impact on how FOI is delivered in Scotland.
Thank you very much, Carol. Can I ask, we've touched on this issue about public contracts being outsourced and the private providers coming under the gambit of FOI. I'm also quite acutely aware of organisations that are set up in Scotland that are huge recipients of public funds from various different sources, whether directly from government or from universities. The one that springs to mind is in my own region, V&A Dundee, which I don't believe falls under the gambit of FOISA, but is a huge recipient of public funds. I don't know if any witnesses have any experience of similar organisations that certainly it looks like perhaps 50+% is funded by the taxpayer but are not subject to FOISA. Do you think these organisations should also come under the gambit? Severin Carroll.
I thought the museum sector was covered, National Museums of Scotland. Does that mean that National Museums of Scotland aren't covered either? I have to say, I haven't
I'm
got
not
to
100% sure about all of them, but I think there are certain organisations that don't.
Well, it just seems to me completely logical that they should be.
And should there be a specific test for that, a 50% funding test, or...? Because these organisations are set up as different companies and private entities in lots of different ways, and how do you then decide?
Wouldn't the question be about what their founding purpose is? If their founding purpose is as a private company and they are charging entry fees for everything, but then manage to get some additional public funding for doing something additional for the public, then fine. But if they're not, because I mean the V&A Dundee is set up as a public institution, is it not? It's entirely publicly funded, with the exception of some a small amount of private charitable donations, but it's lottery funded and Scottish Government funded and Dundee Council funded. So it seems to be axiomatic that it should be. Yeah.
That's helpful, thank you. Carol Urt.
I was just going to raise the point about the scrutiny process by which those organisations are funded. So, you know, if the lottery is putting money in or the local authority is putting money in, they don't just hand over a cheque, they require accountability for the spend. And that's the kind of information that should routinely be proactively published.
Okay, thank you. Rob Edwards.
Just to make a quick point from a wider perspective, stressing that this is very much my personal view and certainly not the view of all journalists. you know, I don't see any reason in principle why, if you've extended FOI to all public sector agencies, then you've extended it to, and if you successfully extend it to all major bodies that spend public money to deliver public services, you shouldn't go several steps further. Extend it to NGOs who provide public services, extend it to private companies, full stop. I mean, I know that's a whole different ballgame, but it seems to me that the principle of FOI, which you know, I think is really important for democracy, transparency, and the health of our society, and you know, it works well in the. If we get it to work well, make improvements, get to work well in the public sector, shouldn't be extended to the third sector and beyond. Perhaps, who knows, even to, you know, journalistic organisations.
Stephen Lowe from Unison.
If you take the an organisation-based approach, you're always playing catch-up, because we're in a situation of repetitive competitive tendering and reorganisation. So, I mean, if you take that Glasgow ICT example, you know, if it's the nature of the organisation that makes you subject to FOI, then you can just change the nature of the organisation for whatever reason, take it and get out of it, whether you're doing it for that purpose or not. Whereas if the principle is that public money is accountable via FOI, then you're not doing that. If you've got a gateway principle like that, as Kevin Dunyon's arguing in his submission, then you avoid that problem, and that's really the way that we ought to be going.
So that principle, Stephen, if I understand you correctly, would be like, our other hat in this committee follow the public pound. If the public pound is going into that organisation, they then become subject to freedom of information. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm quite keen to move on, colleagues, to theme 2. Did anyone else have further? Okay, so theme 2 is users' experiences and responses from public authorities. Claire Cairns has already given us a very interesting example. I'd be interested to hear a bit more on that if you think there's anything you want to add. But would witnesses like to contribute on this theme? Severin Carroll.
Of the joint submission that Rob and I are here to talk about, the obvious one for newspaper journalists and for television and radio journalists will be the role of special advisors and ministers or officials with some sort of public role in public sector bodies influencing how FOI requests are handled, what's disclosed, and putting through an additional level of filtering. The submission that we made goes into some detail about that, and we know that other witnesses to the committee who've put in submissions have made similar cases points too. I think just on a kind of objective point of view, we just need to refer to the Scottish Information Commissioner's submission, and we need also to refer to what Scottish Government ministers have undertaken not to do, which is, or undertaken to do, which is to limit that and to give special advisors and ministers a role in only the most sensitive of cases. And what we need to see is more evidence that that's actually being adhered to, I think. We remain concerned about the fact that perhaps through the sort of backdoor routes which Rob has alluded to, that there are unrecorded ways that special advisors or ministers can influence the disclosure or the handling of FOI requests made by journalists, and that there needs to be a much greater emphasis on a neutrality of approach that is blind to the identity or organisation that's making the application. And Darren Fitzhenry's submission, in my view, and Rob's view, I think, is on the money as far as this is concerned. And it's going back to this fundamental point that this is a universal statutory right which should be blind and equal, and access needs to be equal for all, rather than us being given, even if there's a sense that we get privileges. I mean, Carol's alluded to the Human Rights Act. Of course, we have additional rights in that context, but that doesn't imply that somehow those rights therefore bring with them additional burdens.
So what you're saying is when your request goes into a public authority, be it government or a council, the person dealing with that shouldn't know who it has come from?
I think that's got to be the basic principle. They ought not to be changing the way they behave on the basis of which person it is that's making the request. They ought to be absolutely treated equally, because the flip side of us being treated differently is that somebody who is an ordinary member of the public is treated worse than we are, and that's a problem. And, you know, Claire's experience, it seems to me, is the flip side of this conversation, and that the experience of ordinary members of the public, I mean, we're information professionals. Mm-hmm. We share information amongst ourselves. We know where to look, how to look, and we also know how to chap on the door very loudly if we don't get what we want.
Okay. Claire Cairns, you're nodding your head.
Yes, I suppose I would just make another point about the quality of the information we received. And that's, I wonder, you know, the people responsible for responding to FOIs in local authorities or whoever else it is through health boards or health and social care partnerships are not necessarily the best people who have that information. We know after we did the FOI, we were speaking to the carer leads across Scotland. So these are the people who tend to know in terms of the delivery of services to carers in and out in their area. And they were quite disappointed at some of the responses received from their local authority. They didn't feel they were full enough, or they were perhaps quite vague or not entirely accurate. So I wonder where they get their information from, and is there not more of a process as going back to the people who are more involved in whatever the information provision is? I mean, to give you just maybe one or two examples, in one area we received the response was service proposals from a range of agencies, including the voluntary sector, are currently going through the appropriate governance approval processes and are not confirmed at this time. This is 8 months into the Carers Act being implemented. So that was quite a vague response, but behind the scenes there was actually in that area a lot of very good work going on that wasn't captured from that FOI. Another one, and this was in relation to the question we asked about the £2 million that went in advance of the Carers Act being implemented. And in one area we got a response, the allocated 34,000 will be used to review policies and processes in preparation for the implementation of the Act. That was 8 months into the Act being implemented. So you've got to ask yourself, what does that piece of information mean? And the person who, I suspect a lot of the time, people are just lifting it from old minutes with no actual sense checking or accuracy checking, which means that, for us, the information we received, we had to take it at face value when we were producing our reports, even though we knew some of it probably should have been delved into further.
Thank you very much. I've got Nick McGowan-Lowe, then Bill Bowman.
To echo Severin's experiences, it's the experience of our members who are journalists who put in requests that frequently the requests come back with some kind of indication that they have been handled in a different way because they are journalists or media or broadcasters, and they've come back with indications on them that say this is a journalistic FOI request or a media request. It's unclear, and we can only speculate on one side why that is. I am told confidentially, because we represent members who also are working communications officers and are tasked with FOI, handling FOI requests on behalf of organisations as part of their job, that these are handled differently because they're seen as a greater danger to them. But these two channels shouldn't really exist. They should be. It should certainly be blind as to whether it's coming from a member of the public or a member of the media.
Bill Bowman.
I'd just perhaps go back to something Claire said earlier, and I recognise the issue of getting information that just seems incomplete or doesn't seem right. But is that the job of the person answering, just to give you what's there? Because you said you got information and no explanations. Now, if people start getting into interpreting and explaining, that seems maybe a little bit more dangerous than just giving you what's there. And unfortunately, we then perhaps find out that the information held is not very good. And if I could just then come back to what you were talking about, things like outsourcing. The information, you can't go to these companies, but would you not think the contracting organisation should have the sort of information that you have? And can you not ask them to get it? So I was Claire first, really, I think.
We're planning actually to repeat our FOI, and we're going to be asking for the actual eventual end spend from the question we asked in the previous year. So we think that will gather more information, and we suspect there will be a difference in terms of what people have put forward in almost their intentions of what they plan to spend the money on, and then what actually happened in the end. And I still think that, although I take your point that it's not for the person who is providing the FOI response to interpret that information for us, I did feel that in some areas it was incomplete, which is a different issue entirely. And I think a lot of the responses were speculative, really. You're talking really about 8 months into the implementation of the Act, so at that point they really should have understood what the money was being spent on in that financial year. So in that sense, it was quite disappointing.
But when you say understood, is it not just they give you what they unfortunately have?
Well, I wonder if it was maybe somebody in a room just reading through minutes and then copying and pasting, where I think that doesn't give you a full response, because quite often what is produced in minutes isn't necessarily what ends up happening, because it could be, you know, further information at a later stage which isn't then captured.
Yeah. Sorry.
If to deal with Bill's point about, well, shouldn't you go to the organisation that's doing the contract? Well, there's two things there. One is you've still built in 2 standards. You know, you can go directly to the health board and you can get all sorts of information from the health board, right down to shift patterns, say, levels of staffing and shift patterns. Whereas if it's outsourced to a private company, all you can get is what the health board say the contract should be, which won't go into that level of detail because they're only interested in the end result. Whereas there are all sorts of reasons people might be interested in how that end result is achieved. I have to say Claire's experience of doing that sort of FOI wide-scale exercise, that is exactly our experience centrally. But I have to also say it's generally speaking our members that are responding in an awful lot of public bodies. And it is just simply the case that dealing with FOI is not perceived as a frontline service by most bodies. Yes, it is. I mean, it's a public right. It's a public right in the same way everything else is. But our experience, and we're doing some work with our members in this at the moment, so, but it's still survey stage, so it's a bit anecdotal. But the general trend is clearly, well, the units that deal directly with it have had reductions in staff. Also, there is not a great deal of training goes on in an awful lot of organisations about how FOI requests should be handled. You know, it's maybe something that the 2 or 3 people know who initially get the request get, but then they don't have that information. They've got to find someone else who really is a bit...
Let me put that back to you a little bit, because councils have raised in written evidence the fact that they get vexatious requests.
Well, how do you define vexatious? Once you start going down that route, you are in quite dodgy territory quite quickly. It's either a right or it's not.
Do you think legislation probably needs to deal with that and have some parameters, or do you just think they should just respond and respond and respond?
Well, generally speaking, if they get... Well, no, it's a right. If the information's there, it should be published. I mean, this is another thing. If there were more transparency, there would be less scope for freedom of information requests.
We're going to come on in the next theme to proactive publication. Craig, DL, you've got a point on this.
Yes, so in my personal experience of FOI, I haven't quite had some of the experiences that Severin has brought up, but then maybe that proves his point. I definitely more identify with Claire, where I've had information back that perhaps suggests that the person at the other end has answered the letter of the question rather than the spirit of the question. They've given just the absolute bare minimum to get the question dealt with, and that has had issues with us. As a think tank, compared to other think tanks, we work fast. The journalists will know what tight deadlines look like. They're maybe a little faster than us even. So having to wait for the FOI response and then finding out that it's a bit insufficient and having to follow up on it pushes your deadlines way out. Very tricky to get around. Similar, maybe some of my questions have been seen as vexatious. I don't know. I don't know what's going on at the other side, which kind of gets us back to what we'll talk about later on, this need for proactive disclosure to just sidestep that problem entirely.
Okay, I've got Liam Kerr and Anas Sarwar before we move on to theme 3.
Thank you, Convener. It's a question that arises from some of the answers that we've heard, particularly Stephen Lowe just there, but also Severin Carroll and Carol, you were talking earlier on about the difficulties at the local authority level. I think, Severin, you specifically mentioned local authorities, and there's no one easy system to do it. But a number of the representations that we've had talk about the cost and the resource cost at particularly the local council level of getting huge numbers of freedom of information requests. And I picked up Rob Edwards talking about extending this to the third sector, where it could be even more challenging, one would have thought. So if that's right, do you recognise that that is an issue? And if so, what is the solution?
The first thing I'd refer back to is the point that we've addressed a couple of times, and Jenny asked Stephen the question about why, and the why is it's a statutory right. That's the first thing. There is a point at which when you hear from public sector bodies accepting that FOI is a public good, that if that is the basic point, it's a statutory right and a public good, then that ought to be embedded in everything that they do. It's not a peripheral offering. It's not something that they'll do if they've got the time and the resource to do it. It's something they need to make part of their central service provision, if you like. Now, I absolutely accept that there are resource costs. But, I mean, there's a sense in which I'm afraid some local authorities are using special pleading because we all have resource pressures. My industry is under enormous resource pressures because my industry has lost many, many journalists. Our budgets are being slashed. The pressure on colleagues, particularly in a lot of Scottish newspapers, to produce large quantities of copy are immense. So we can make the same special pleading case as well. And I think, that there is an obligation, I would say, on us to a degree, also to make sure that our requests are properly structured and are focused. So we ask questions that we expect that they can answer and not ask daft laddie questions if we can't. And actually, it's poor research if you ask the daft laddie question anyway, I think. I think the issue for the local authorities is they just need to try and work out why it is they think that public scrutiny, transparency and accountability are not things that they regard as central to their core purpose. Because it seems to me they absolutely are. They just need to reorient the way they approach the whole topic, okay. I would say.
Thank you. Nick McGowan-Lowe.
Thank you. To first pick up on the point you've just made, I completely agree. Our journalists are under so much pressure, they don't have time to put in silly requests. That's something that has come out of us talking to them. They're under so much pressure. They put in requests because they need to know information which needs to be in the public domain. You asked the question about whether it should be part of the day job for organisations to reveal that. Absolutely. Providing information which should be in the public domain should be part of the day job for organisations spending public money. Thirdly, to pick up on this idea of vexatious requests, any public service throws itself open to abuse, but the language that we're using here I'm particularly worried about. It clearly mirrors the idea of the vexatious litigant and the idea that there are public services such as courts, such as freedom of information, that should, under certain circumstances, be taken away from people who abuse them. Clearly, what is vexatious has to be clearly considered and carefully considered, and the court service does this very, very carefully. The number of vexatious litigants, and these are people for whom to bring a court action they have to go through extra steps. It isn't completely withdrawn for them, but the number of people on that list is an absolute fraction.
Clarify, vexatious is in the Act, I think. Are you suggesting that should be taken out of the Act?
No, but it clearly mirrors the idea of the vexatious litigant which exists in the court service, and there are clear barriers there. What we don't want is the idea of vexatious to be defined on the person who is receiving the question.
Okay, I understand. Okay. Rob Edwards.
Two kind of slightly different points. While we're on vexatious, which I understand is controversial, I think the Information Commissioner makes the point that the current Act gives people, public authorities, enough leeway and shouldn't be changed. And personally, I'd agree with that. And the Information Commissioner also makes the point, and I think this is the key thing that relates to what Sev was saying about it being a universal right. It is the daft questions asked by persistently by members of the public who think something is wrong that reveal things of great public interest. I mean, that's how it's meant to work. Now, that might seem like it's vexatious to a highly pressed public official, but it's what the Act is for. I would be very worried if, as some of the submissions this committee is suggesting, we should widen or expand or make it easier to use the vexatious exemption, because that would deprive lots of people of their rights that could mean that things that should be of public interest were kept secret. The second point, which kind of goes counter to this, is that, I mean, you know, every year I go to, I've been doing for years, to the, as others here have, to the Hollywood Events Annual Conference on Freedom of Information, and that's mostly full of scores of freedom of information officers from all the public agencies. And, you know, I take my hat off to them. A lot of them work very, very hard to enforce the Act and give people the right to information. But, you know, some of them are stuck in organizations where their hierarchies still think that freedom of information is an add-on or something that, some kind of annoying thing that they have to do. That would be wrong to say that that's, you know, universal. And I think there are lots of really good freedom of information officers, many of them, I don't know, Unison members, who work very hard within public sector agencies to convince their agencies to do the right thing.
Thank you. Willie Coffey, MSP.
Thanks very much, Jenny. I'm just looking back at the record from the Commissioner when he met us in March about this issue about vexatious inquiries. It does apply to numbers of inquiries as well, and I recall my colleague Alec Neil mentioned that some person sent 84 FOIs within an hour. So there is provision there. The Commissioner has the power to reject that under this term vexatiousness, and he also said that the Court of Session judgment gave some clarification in this, but it's clearly still an issue for people. You know, somebody said if information is there, let's have it, because it reveals certain things that are of public interest. So does the panel feel that we kind of need to look at this a wee bit more detail to try and clear up what is vexatious and what isn't, and who determines whether it's vexatious or not?
Severin Carroll, what would you do in that instance?
Well, I would ask the organisations that use this, and the problem that I have with a lot of the evidence that I've read that you've had on this is that the vexatious notion, this concept, has been weaponised somewhat as a way of being able to push back, erect barriers, increase costs, make life more difficult for general applicants, is ask these organisations for evidence. Prove it. Give us a breakdown. Tell us what these cases were. Give us the percentages. Tell us exactly how much extra effort was required in order to deal with these as a proportion of the entire FOI burden that you have to fulfil. I mean, we quite deliberately, when we put this submission in, went further than than our letter of 2 years ago to provide evidence. Because we're making a whole series of very critical points about organisations that we deal with on a day-to-day basis professionally, and we came up with proof. We proved it. We said, look, these are the exact cases, and we can evidence these, and we need these local authorities to evidence what they're claiming is wrong with the system, rather than just throwing out claims or assertions.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to take Carol Ewart, and then I'm going to move on to the theme of record keeping and proactive publication. Carol Ewart on this point.
I just wanted to come back to your question, Liam, about the issue around cost. And I would just echo what has been previously said, that the Scottish Parliament has decided that this is a free and enforceable right. And you have delegated 10,000 plus organisations in Scotland to deliver that right. Now, of course, there was going to be a cost attached to it, but when the legislation was passed, the Minister, Jim Wallace, said openness and transparency and accountability are fundamental to Scotland as we're setting up the Scottish Parliament and a new way of doing politics. Therefore, there's no extra money actually available to you to deliver this, because you should be just doing it anyway. And that was predicated in the belief that there'd be lots of proactive publication of information, and so the amount of cost to an agency by answering FOI requests would not be huge. And I do think the two issues are intertwined. I also just want to emphasise the point about staffing. Certainly, there is some disquiet as to the number of staff allocated to answer FOI requests. And in the individual departments, whether it's to do with carers or whatever, staff have been depleted. So their availability to gather together the information to provide to the FOI officer, who then can answer the FOI request, it's all impacting on staff's overworked day, and I understand the pressures that they're under. But it comes back to the point that Severin was making. This is a corporate responsibility, and a focus needs to be, we are committed to this, we are going to deliver at this, and we're going to deliver it well. Which brings me to the other point about cost. The Scottish Government is still subject to enforcement action by the Scottish Information Commissioner. There is a cost to the public purse because the Scottish Government isn't meeting its legal obligations, and that's a worry. And also there is a cost to the Information Commissioner because public agencies who are designated are not delivering FOI rights. That causes appeals to the Commissioner. So the system is creating additional costs for failure to comply in the first place.
Thank you very much, Carol. I'm going to ask Colin Beattie, MSP, to open up our next theme.
Thank you, Vera. Partly we've touched on this already in the earlier discussions we had, but the Act applies only to recorded information. So if the information doesn't exist, then it can't be provided under the Act. Now, a number of respondents have actually highlighted concerns that certain information is not being recorded and not being minuted. Do witnesses have any examples of this, and what can be done about it?
Witnesses. Severin.
Well, I can just help start with that, if you like, is the Rob Edwards and I and colleagues of his at the Ferret have done a lot of work, again, going back to the Scottish Futures Trust, and we know from FOI requests by ourselves and by others that there have been meetings held, for instance, between government ministers and senior figures in the Scottish Futures Trust that have taken place off campus, as it were. Breakfast meetings at Contini's on George Street, or meetings that have taken place inside government buildings where minutes have not been taken. They're recorded in the ministerial diary, but there's no minutes, no agenda is published. And we think we know that this is something which is widespread across the way government and other public organisations work, and we're absolutely certain that this is a constant issue in local government too. Then we get to this really core issue here about democratic accountability and about the capacity of constituents and voters and citizens to be able to actually know what their elected representatives are doing on their behalf. And if there are all these unminuted meetings taking place on matters involving huge sums of public money or public contracts and so forth, it's quite important. Can I just add quickly one final thing? There is a new aspect to this question, which is not just the duty to record, but the inclusion of non-official means of communication. And this is something we know the Scottish Parliament is wrestling with presently with the special inquiry into the Scottish Government's handling of the inquiry into Alex Salmond, you know, the disciplinary side of things at civil service level. And the question about access to WhatsApp messages, Telegram, or private email communication. This is also an issue at Westminster presently with the Brexit affair and everything that's happening at Downing Street. And when I was researching this, I was reminded that there is already, for instance, I mean, one of the most interesting characters of all is Dominic Cummings. And we discovered there was a piece in the FT in September 2011 where it was proof that Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove and other UK government ministers at the time were using back-channel communications, using their own private email addresses or their wives' private email addresses in order to discuss government business explicitly to avoid detection. And when the Department for Education was challenged by the Information Commissioner and the FT about this, the Department for Education was able to say legally, under the Act, this is not held or recorded. No, it wasn't held and recorded by them, but it was by Google, Yahoo or Hotmail. And there is that question about whether we need to have a much broader understanding of what our rights are to access information, as well as get it recorded, if it is recorded off campus, unofficially, that's also captured too.
Taking the examples that you gave in Scotland,
yeah.
Are you suggesting that every meeting of a government minister or official should actually be minuted and available?
Okay, so look, I mean,
there's a limit on that.
No, of course there is, and we've discussed this, and this is me speaking on my own behalf rather than on behalf of the group of journalists, but it seems to me that there's a point at which the question that, well, so these meetings are organised and arranged generally by civil servants. These ministers are, these meetings are being organised to prosecute public policy. Civil servants are involved with that, and it seems to me there's a point at which the private office ought to be empowered with ministers to be able to say, Minister, this needs to be recorded because it involves X, or civil servants in that particular directorate ought to be empowered to say, Minister, that because this involves X, it needs to be recorded and minuted. And so there has to be some sense in which the civil servants are empowered to have a level of oversight or intervention to make sure that a particular standard is upheld. Now, of course, there are some things that be routine, some things that won't actually necessarily involve significant amounts of public money or pivotal moments of public policy development. Sure, fine. But when they are, when you have Angus Grossart meeting a Scottish Government minister, when Angus Grossart Scottish Futures Trust is in charge of close to £10 billion worth of public money over the lifetime of SFT projects, that those things are properly minuted and not held in continis on George Street.
Sorry to pursue that with you, but would you say then that what you're boiling this down to is that where a critical decision is being taken in connection with public finances or policy, that should be minuted?
Well, look,
it's a bit of a judgment.
I know, but I mean, I'm just throwing it out there because, of course, it's a topic for conversation. There has to be balance struck, and there's a limit to resources and so on and so forth. But the idea that this ought not to be dealt with simply because it's difficult or is going to involve some sort of balance or test needs to be avoided. We need to have the conversation, work out what the balance is, work out what the tests are.
Thank you. Stephen Lowe.
Another example. Unison represents the workforce in Scottish Water, and as such we take an interest in the structure of it. So we were working with a young PhD researcher, he was young when he started, who was looking at the private water industry and its attempts to get involved in Scotland. And he asked for the diary of the Water Industry Commissioner to see who the Water Industry Commissioner was having meetings with. This became a long, drawn-out fight with and the Information Commissioner eventually ruled that the Water Industry Commissioner's diary was something that should be publicly accessible. And indeed it showed that there were lots of meetings with private water companies. And then the Water Industry Commissioner stopped keeping a diary. So when the next request went in, it's like, well, no, we don't keep a diary anymore. I've no idea how, because it's a number of years ago, but that was at that point, it was a diary. So, I mean, how he plans his day, I've no idea, you know, but there we go. He no longer keeps a diary.
And ask Sarwar.
Just a follow-up to that point. So freedom of information is about opening up access, opening up transparency. Do you think government, local authorities, officials now deliberately avoid putting things down on paper or recording things because they don't want to be caught out by the FOI legislation? If that is the case, surely that defeats the entire purpose of the legislation.
Rob Edwards?
I would be hard put to prove that in a court of law. But if you ask me for my personal opinion about whether it happens, yes. How widespread it is, I don't know. And this is experience over many years, and it's special advisors saying, don't email me, call me, you know, and we all know how these things work. And by definition, trying to put in an FOI request to find out how people avoid FOI is pretty tricky. And, you know...
Have you tried it?
Yes, but without any success. And I think that, you know, it's one of those things that you can't put numbers on, you can't quantify, but, you know, you could knock me down with a feather if it wasn't happening.
Okay, thank you.
So
Carol Ewart. Carol Ewart.
I just want to come back to the issue around recording. And, you know, I take the committee's point. I mean, you're in a dilemma. Does the law need to get changed, or are we actually simply requiring that current practice or current rules are followed? And the Civil Service Code says that minutes involving substantive government business, those meetings must be minuted. Now, what's substantive to me might not be substantive to somebody else. So I think that needs to be more rigorously applied. The model publication scheme, which all designated bodies must accept, it requires minutes and papers about proceedings and business to be made available. There's issues around the delay between the meeting actually happening and the minute appearing. I remember having a conversation with someone who said, oh, well, it's a couple of months since we've published the minutes, but somebody was ill and we were looking for some further information. I said, but it was a minute of the meeting that was held on that date. You shouldn't be adding anything into it subsequently. So there's all sorts of devices to delay publication. There's also the Public Records Act, and there's also a presumption in FOI that through the model publication scheme, that those kinds of meetings, those minutes, those agendas, they will be subject to scrutiny. So again, it goes to the culture. It goes to the culture of organisations, and it goes also to the whether or not there's an absolute commitment at the highest level about openness, transparency and accountability.
Okay. Thank you very much. I quickly want to touch on this point about, we've really covered minutes there, minuting meetings, how it's avoided, etc. Proactive publications. Claire Cairns' evidence was really striking for me, because it seemed to me that perhaps a lot of the information you were asking for, Claire, would have been a lot easier if it was just published on the website or made publicly available. Can we move on to that briefly? Should some of the information you were seeking have actually just been available to you?
Yes, absolutely. It would have made our job a lot easier. And for example, that information could have been included in various publications. Each area had to publish a local carer strategy this year, or towards the end of last year. They should have had within that the money that they had allocated to carer support, both through the additional money they received for the Carers Act and the money that they allocated from other sources as well, but it's not included in most of them. So simple things like that, which means that, you know, somebody like me can look at it, but also a carer in their local area who wants to know information about carer support can look it up. And I don't think it's that easy, and I don't think it's the only area where you'll find that. I think one of the most difficult things is looking at how money flows from its initial allocation through budgets and then eventually how it's spent. It's not an easy transition to follow that. And even now, having done the FO, I don't think we have the answers in all the areas.
Thank you. Craig DL.
We have had this debate about where that line of freedom of information should sit, whether it stays where it is right now or whether it should be pushed up. I want to reiterate again, wherever that line ends up, everything below it, everything covered by it, should be proactively published. We shouldn't have to ask the questions. Anything that would be disclosed under a reasonable FOI request should just be proactively disclosed. And if that involves designing new infrastructure, designing new systems, if that involves resource costs, well, transparency is crucial to democracy. If democracy is not cheap, fine. I'm not saying it's going to be cheap, I'm saying it's worth it.
But how do public authorities kind of second guess what questions they might get to proactively make that information available?
We need to have a good, hard think about what kind of information we're storing, what kind of information should be publicly disclosed, and start building that into the foundations of our information gathering.
Okay, can I put something to you? I have just put in an FOI request across Scotland to discover how many single-sex female beds and wards are disappearing across our hospitals in Scotland. How would the health board second guess that I wanted that information? And if perhaps the disclosure of that information makes it clear that they've actually cut beds over the last few years, why would they proactively make that available?
Well, that information should probably be available. The number of beds should be probably available on some sort of database, some sort of spreadsheet. You should be able to go in, look at the longitudinal data and be able to interrogate that yourself.
Okay. Severin Carroll and then Stephen Lowe.
It is possible to look at other jurisdictions for models for proactive publication. There's a lot of stuff that one colleague of ours, Martin McLaughlin's doing a lot at the moment on Donald Trump's sojourns in Scotland and how much money's been spent on his behalf at his own facilities. And much of that information is derived from a database. There are several databases that the American government and its agencies have, which are put online. So, for instance, all contracts with the Department of Defence and the State Department are proactively published. And in fact, I think pretty much every single federal agency publishes its commercial contracts, its procurement contracts, at least in headline form, online proactively.
You say Trump's government's more transparent than our government, so?
Well, yes. On this, it absolutely is, but that's nothing to do with Donald Trump, I hasten to add.
No,
this has been around for quite some time. And I think at state level, that's the same in the United States. And there are other European countries as well, and I think you've had evidence to this effect, where publication is a duty. It's not an add-on. And so you simply design your systems as government. And we know with the availability of cloud computing and of public databases and extremely freeware databases, there's not a huge cost. It's not as if you're going to IBM and asking them to design from scratch a data set or software package. It's all available.
Thank you. Stephen Lowe.
On your specific example about single-sex facilities, surely if health boards are carrying out proper equalities impact assessments, the information would be there, and they wouldn't need to get it. Specifically, following up on Severin's point, there are any number across the world of places who publish vast amounts of detailed information. You can look at the London Mayor, which London Mayor was responsible, I don't know, but they've got a wall of iPads, and you can just go in, do all sorts of things. Baltimore, more famous around here for The Wire, but in Baltimore, if you report a broken streetlight, you can actually track what happens to that complaint and when it gets put in. And if you're publishing that level of detail, you're not going to have hellish many FOI requests. But on them, I remember the early days when the Act came in, the standard where you would get a response, you put an FOI request in, and then you would get an email back with a link to the website where your response had been published. Now, I just had a wee look the other day. Very few authorities are doing that anymore. So I might put in a request, it gets answered, but Severin doesn't know that it's been answered. So he puts in a very, very similar request, and the authority's got to go through it again. If they were proactively publishing even the results of FOI requests, it might help a bit.
Okay, Alex Neil.
Can I just make the point and make a distinction between the Parliament and government, whether at local or national level, because the Scottish Parliament had this problem right at the beginning, where we literally got flooded with requests on a daily basis, mainly about MSP's expenses. And for the first 4 years of the Parliament, almost every day there was a headline about some, expense issue. When George Reid became the presiding officer, he changed the system entirely and put all the expenses, and they appear now on a regular basis, proactively on the Parliament website. And there are three consequences of that. Number one, the number of FOIs has collapsed enormously. Number two, the costs involved have gone down enormously because people didn't need to fish around to get information. But the other thing is, I think behaviour changed, and it changed both in terms, in this case, primarily journalists, but it changed in terms of the MSPs, because I think some people gave more thought to what they were charging the Parliament, knowing full well that it was proactively going to appear a month later or 2 months later in the Parliament website. So I think the evidence for the benefits of proactive publication from our own example, any MSP in here, and some party leaders at the time opposed it, and they're the biggest fans because they realise, the benefits of it. And it seems to me that, of all the issues we're discussing, the solution, and we need to look for a solution to these problems, that a good chunk of the solution lies in proactive publication. And the Parliament's experience, I think, demonstrates beyond any reasonable doubt the benefits of proactive publication. And I think, I think there's universal agreement on that, quite frankly. I mean, I can't remember.
Does anyone want to disagree with Alec on that point? No takers. Alec, I think you wanted to move on to solutions.
Well, that's the start of the solutions, but it seems to me, I mean, basically, my question is, what do you want to do? I mean, there's loads of submissions, loads of recommendations and so on. It seems to be that proactive publication is top of the list there in terms of effectiveness in improving the system. But what would the panel members, or not MSPs, see as the top 3 or 4 things that they want the Parliament to do to try to improve this situation and rectify the problems in FOI legislation and how it's being applied. As Mrs Thatcher used to say, bring me the solution, not just the problem.
This committee will compile a report at the end of our evidence taking, making recommendations on what should, perhaps, if the Act should be, if it should be revised, and perhaps if it should, then what those changes might be. So we're keen to hear any solutions, as Mr Neil says. Claire Cairns.
Just a very simple one Carol's mentioned already, but I think all the contacts should be available in one place. It would make things a lot easier, and it should be quite clear who you need to send the information to. So the example I gave about if it's information from the Health and Social Care Partnership, is it the local authority, is it the Health Board, is it directly to them? That needs to be very clear.
Thank you. Rob Edwards.
Well, I mean, in our submission, we made a series of specific recommendations, which Sev and I have referred to. You know, a clear duty to record to avoid unminuted or unrecorded things, expanding freedom of information to include, bodies that derive all or substantial portion of their income from the public sector. We've mentioned some of them. Removing the Crown Office's exemption, limiting the rules on non-disclosure of material concerning the royal family, limiting the rights of ministers and special advisors to oversee or influence information requests, clearer duties on public bodies to follow best practice, and several other recommendations. So, And
we've got them. Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you very much, Rob. Bailey Lee Robb.
So for young people, what do young people want to see? So we want the Scottish Information Commissioner to create a easy to use template for young people to send to public authorities to use. So it's the same across the board, that all 32 will use the standardised form.
All 32 councils.
All 32 councils, yeah. We also want the Scottish Information Commissioner to educate and engage young people with the partners on freedom of information, and we're calling on the government for it to be taught in schools to raise awareness so that young people know that they can use freedom of information. We also think that there should be like a specific media campaign on to raise awareness amongst young people, because as I said earlier, only 25%, so a quarter of young people are aware that they have the rights under the Freedom of Information Act. So things on social media, through schools, youth groups and voluntary organisations should be used to raise that awareness, and also things to speed it up so that you get it answered quicker.
Thank you very much. Craig DL.
I'll endorse all the suggestions so far. Another couple I would like to add. If we're not going for the full glass wall, total proactive disclosure, then we probably need some sort of FOI advice centre, a single shop where people can go to get advice on writing an FOI, to form the question that they want to ask, to get the maximum benefit from it, and to get advice on where to send it. Even for stuff that is proactively disclosed, that advice centre might be able to help with directing people towards databases. So if, to take the question you brought up earlier, if someone wants to try and find information on hospital beds, well, someone can help point them to it.
Okay, thank you. Carol Ewart.
Just to emphasise the importance of the central point, because it would also set out the 10,000 plus public sector bodies that are already designated. It would also add value because it would list what the publicly owned companies are, if we ever find out what they are, and ALIOs as well. And it would also, looking ahead to the designation of RSLs and their subsidiaries, it would list which of the RSL subsidiaries are actually going to be covered by FOISA, because that is still unclear. Secondly, we definitely believe the model publication scheme must be enforced by the Commissioner, and it has to be used better. They set out a template, and that could be replicated on every designated body's website with links to all the information that comes under those headings. And we also reckon that there's room for improvement in appeals to the Commissioner, because at the moment when you make an FOI request, you don't actually need to mention FOISA. It's just taken as a given. I'm asking for information, please provide it. But the appeals process actually is pretty complicated for people. Despite the terminology in the legislation, it shouldn't be so complicated. People will tell us that they want to make an appeal, and what they want to do is just say to the Commissioner, these are all the things that happen to us, and we think it's wrong, and we don't think it's in the spirit of the law. But you tend to have to make a very detailed explanation, including the fact that though it's glaringly obvious, they didn't respond within 20 days, but you need to state that as a problem before the Commissioner takes it up.
Yes.
So that system could be improved too.
Carol, thank you very much for that. And you've taken me neatly onto theme 4, which I anticipate will be quite short, but it's on review, applications and appeals. So you've given us a point there on appeals. Would anyone else like to address that process? Several.
I'm happy to just on the basis again of our submission. I mean, we would like to see a capacity to be able to appeal the Scottish Information Commissioner's rulings and judgments about appeals we have made to them. Now, there is an English system of having an information tribunal, and I know the Commissioner's given evidence on this, and he feels it extremely unwieldy, costly and delayed, but he's also flagged this idea that maybe the SIC should have the capacity to investigate its own decisions internally. This, I think, however, goes to the question which, Alex, you may talk about the Scottish Parliament being very proactive on publication, but as I understand it, the Scottish Parliament is also the funding body for the Scottish Information Commissioner. And our view is we think that the SIC probably needs a bit more money from you guys so it can do its job better and just kind of expand its role and start being more proactive and do its own appeals more quickly. Its appeals process is very clunky often. It is time consuming. And often for us professional journalists, putting in an application, as Carol says, is often quite an intellectual test and challenge, because trying to re-examine the process that we've got to before we even get to the appeal and then try and explain what we think is wrong and why we think it's wrong is quite a burden. We would like to see the Commissioner being much more proactive and just taking the whole body of that experience and examining it top to bottom. Because I've had experiences myself where I think I know what the issues are, and the Commissioner said, well, actually, that's not the problem. You have to go and think about that again and come back to us, you know.
Thank you. Any further points on theme 4 on the appeals process? Okay. Can I therefore ask members if they have any last questions in this session? Bill Bowman.
If I can just go back, I think, to the very beginning, when Carol, if I can ask you, you said something like the Freedom of Information Act process of the kind the public want to see. Do you think the public have a real interest in this, or what do you base that statement on, the public want to see?
Well, this predates FOI, of course, law being passed in the first place in Scotland, and there was very vibrant conversations about the kinds of information people would want to see. And it's been the subject of polling by the Scottish Information Commissioner on a regular basis. And people will say, for example, that they want to have information about how public money is spent, and they want information about public services, how they're delivered. And so that there's already quite a lot of information there. But what we also know is immediately that there's maybe an announcement from the Scottish Government about child and adult mental health services and an increase in funding. People say, well, I want to know what impacts on my local community, because the Scottish Government, by virtue of making the announcement, has made it a matter of public interest, and people want to follow that up. And, you know, I've been to meetings recently where people have said, well, that the money that's come from the Scottish Government, it's very difficult to understand where it's actually gone on a local basis. So local authorities, health boards, they're constantly making announcements, and people very often are prompted by those kinds of announcements to make FOI requests. So I don't think we can always anticipate what the public want, but I think that's the whole point about FOI. You have the right to make the request for information, and you have the right to receive the answer unless it's proactively published.
Thank you.
When something comes up that perhaps relates to them?
Or their community,
Well,
or their place of work, or about why their place of work is closing and what intervention there has been. I mean, and even just things like GP surgeries are covered by FOI. They're designated. And there's been a lot of conversations recently prompted by the issues in America about monies that have been given by pharmaceutical companies to doctors. You know, people are talking about, well, has that got any impact in Scotland, for example? And I say, well, use FOI law and find out.
Okay. Do members have any further questions before we finish this session? MSPs? Okay. Witnesses, I know Craig DL has a point, and then I'll bring in any final points from our witnesses. Craig DL.
Just in answer to Bill, if hypothetically the Scottish Government announced tomorrow that it was scrapping the FOI Act, I'm pretty sure public interest would spike.
It could be a technique. Bailey Lee Robb.
I think just to finish up, and I think it ties back into what Bill was saying, is the public interested. I think the public are interested. That's my view, not the Scottish Youth Parliament's view. But coming back to it, at the Scottish Youth Parliament, we believe, and I suppose this extends to adults as well, that the information that we request, we aren't all lawyers or journalists or technical people. And I suppose young people, when they ask for information, they just want it in plain English. They want it to be accessible so we can understand it. And I think that needs to be stressed, because if you're getting information back and it's too clunky, it's too jargony, what was the point in waiting for 20 days or even longer?
That's a good point. Any further points from our witnesses? Rob Edwards.
It's one sentence. In my experience, people make FOI requests about things they care about, right? And people care about a lot of things that affect them. So that's always going to be the case.
Thank you. Nick McGowan-Lowe.
I agree with the points my colleagues have made today, but to pick up on a point that I made in my opening remarks, openness, transparency and accountability of public bodies are values which journalists, the public and this legislation shares. Within that, it's a matter of concern to us that within some of the other submissions that have been made to this committee is this undercurrent that as I phrased it before, journalism is this a kind of thing which stops people getting in the way of their jobs, instead of being the way in which the public hold public bodies to account when they spend public money. One of the submissions says that the Act was created for individuals, not media houses, which is frankly astonishing. It is journalists and individuals have the same rights under the Act. It goes on to complain that it's questionable what the public interest is in some requests. Some are clearly just journalistic exercises. Journalistic exercises are concerned with the public interest here. We can't pretend that this is some kind of Venn diagram where the two circles are completely unrelated.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any further points from our witnesses? Stephen Lowe, you look like.
It's absurd that we have a situation whereby someone in Aberdeen has more rights to find out about what's happening in their school than someone in Glasgow or Edinburgh, simply because of a contractual arrangement. That is an inadequacy in the existing setup. There should be a single principle that with public money comes public accountability. And the principle should not be the name of the organisation or the corporate structure of the organisation. The principle should be we're allowed to follow the money.
Severin Carroll.
So I'd just like to say on my own behalf, and I'm sure on behalf of my colleagues, just thank you for doing this. That's the first thing. The fact that we're having this session is absolutely terrific. And reading a lot of the evidence that you've had has been fantastically useful, because we now understand what some of the mindsets are that we need to start talking about. The first thing is, the primary thing I would say is that this is an extraordinary opportunity for the Scottish Parliament. And you have the chance now to produce an information transparency regime for the future, which is going to surpass everything we presently have. And it's undoubtedly a public good. It undoubtedly strengthens our democracy, and it undoubtedly strengthens the country if we have much better transparency. And I would personally urge you to seize the chance.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to close this session. I'd like to thank our witnesses very much indeed. I think it's been a dynamic and a very informative session for us this morning. The next evidence session on post-legislative scrutiny of freedom of information will take place on 3rd of October, and the committee is going to hear from regulators and academics. Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to briefly suspend this meeting for a changeover of witnesses. I'll suspend until 10:37. Thank you. Item 3 is the Section 22 report on the 2018-19 audit of Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Cairngorm Mountain and Funicular Railway. Can I welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning? Caroline Gardner, Auditor General for Scotland, Gordon Smale, Audit Director, and Maggie Bruce, Senior Audit Manager, all from Audit Scotland. I'll also welcome Edward Mountain MSP, who is attending this session in the committee this morning. Auditor General, would you like to make an opening statement on this report?
Thank you, Convener. Briefly, today's report on the 2018-19 audit of Highlands and Islands Enterprise provides a summary of the circumstances surrounding High's establishment of a subsidiary company, Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited, or CMSL, to take over the operation of the Cairngorm Mountain Ski Resort. I intend to prepare a more detailed report on High's management of the ski resort, including the Funicular Railway, in spring 2020. Cairngorm Mountain Range is an environmental and economic asset for Scotland, playing a key role in underpinning the local tourism industry and the economy. High is the long-term owner and custodian of Cairngorm Mountain, and it began the construction of a funicular railway to serve the ski resort in 1999. Convener, I'll apologise in advance for the number of acronyms that crop up in this report and as I'm talking, but happy to clarify what we can. Cairngorm Mountain Limited, CML, assumed operation of the funicular railway in 2001 under a lease agreement with High. CML experienced financial losses and High took CML into public control back in 2008 to keep the resort open. It transferred ownership to Natural Assets Investments Limited, or NAIL, in June 2014, following a competitive dialogue procurement process. In September 2018, CML took the funicular railway out of service because of safety concerns. In October, it requested a working capital loan of up to £1.8 million from High in order to ensure the continuation of winter sports activities while the funicular was closed. High's board rejected the request because of concerns over CML's ability to repay the loan and because NAIL was not offering any security if CML defaulted. CML subsequently went into administration and High established CMSL in December 2018 to take over operation of the ski resort. High's 2018-19 financial statements make a number of references to CMSL, including an accounting provision of £9.6 million to reflect its obligation to repair the funicular. High continues to develop proposals for the future operation of the funicular. This has involved in-house teams and consultancy support to consider options. A key issue is the likely cost of bringing the funicular back to full working order and the development of a business strategy which will provide for the long-term sustainability of the resort. High intends to repair and reopen the funicular, but it is still not clear how much it will cost to do so, how it will be afforded, or what impact it will have on High's financial position. This is likely to require some tough decisions to be made over the coming months. Convener, as you know, these events and the future of the Cairngorm Funicular Railway have generated significant public and media interest. It is important that High can demonstrate that its decision to transfer CML to NAIL was robust, that it managed its relationship with CML well, and that its decision-making in the run-up to the company's administration was well-founded. This will be the subject of my fuller performance report next year. In the meantime, we'll do our best to answer the committee's questions this morning.
Thank you very much, Auditor General. I'm going to ask Liam Kerr to open questioning for the committee.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Before I start, we've come off a session on transparency, and just for the avoidance of any doubt, I got married at this resort, but I will be as objective as ever. You've set out the company structure very clearly at the start there, Auditor General, but what were the responsibilities of each of these companies?
I'll ask Gordon to talk you through that as the auditor of High, who's looked very closely at this.
It is a complicated structure, as we've just heard, and particularly over recent months as events have unfolded. Primarily, though, the key thing is that the assets, the funicular, the buildings, and the business on the mountain are actually owned by High. So they're in public ownership. The assets are in public ownership, and what we've got here is a structure whereby over time different companies have been responsible for operating the business on the mountain. So in other words, the operate the day-to-day business. They pay, until recently, high rental income for the use of the assets and operate the businesses in that style. So there is a clear separation. I think in a technical sense, it's an agency agreement whereby High hands over the rights of operation of its assets, the public assets, for a company, CML, up until around about autumn last year, and since then CMSL, to operate the assets on the mountain.
I understand, thank you. Coming to October 2018, if I may, that so High, you've still got CML in there, and CML, the funicular's closed, the railway, and CML requests a working capital loan of around 1.8 million to carry on the activities whilst the funicular's closed. I think that's rejected by High, isn't it? And if so, was CML very clear? Had it set out, this is what we need £1.8 million for, and here's how we're going to spend it?
So we need to look at that in more detail, and that's very much the separation. And this might be part of the conversation this morning, the separation between what we brought forward here in relation to High's 18-19 accounts and the work that we're planning to do to understand better the circumstances that happened round about that time. In a broad sense, though, a business case was brought forward. High had to consider that, and as I said a minute ago, the key thing for High in this is to make sure it protects the public asset that it's responsible for. It's got responsibilities to make sure that these assets are safeguarded and used to best effect. So High had presented with the circumstances. High had to do something. We need to look more carefully and closely to make some judgments about what actually happened round about that time. As I say, around about autumn last year, as you're saying, when things started to unfold in a particular way, particularly, I think, brought forward by the problems with the funicular itself.
Mm-hmm. You may give me a similar answer to this follow-up question, but I think at the same meeting where 1.8 million was requested by CML and rejected by High, there was also talk of a £1 million investment in snow-making equipment, presumably to keep the resort working. That was approved. High did approve that. Did they approve that for CML to purchase this equipment, or was this something that High purchased for itself?
As you anticipate, that's the type of thing we want to look at in a bit more detail. Our understanding, just to help the committee, is that that High was on track to look at options about what might be available to help support, in particular, skiing and winter sports, given the experience over recent years in terms of the availability of snow for these things. Mm-hmm. So our understanding is that High was going down the path of investigating how to improve the business on the mountain through snow-making, snow-spreading equipment. But as I say, we have to unpick that a wee bit and understand the sequence of events better.
Yes, because if it were High that were getting involved in that sort of thing, then High has stopped being simply a landowner, and it's becoming much more the operator that you've described earlier that CML was.
I think High, in the same way as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, High owns the assets on the mountain and is looking what further assets may be available to support the business on the mountain. As I say, it's responsibility for the operation of the operations on the mountain, the public assets, and indeed to help support all the other related issues in terms of the economy and tourism and the like. So there's lots of elements to that. But as I say, these would really be the types of things we'd want to look at in more detail as we get under the skin of some of the events that were happening around about that time.
Mm-hmm.
Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Audit General, perhaps I could say from the start there's a slightly different feel to this report than the ones you produce normally. It's more a sort of a position statement than taking it to the next level, and I presume that's what you were referring to when you said you're going to be revisiting that. What is the timescale for the follow-up report?
You're absolutely right, Mr. Beattie. This is one of the Section 22 reports that I have the power to produce on the back of an individual body's annual audited accounts. There is a fixed timescale in legislation for doing that and a deadline by which they need to be laid. Given the public interest, I thought it was appropriate to bring this report on the back of the 18-19 accounts to the committee now. As Gordon has said, we're doing the work that's needed to answer those wider questions, not just about decision-making last autumn, but about the decision to enter into an agreement with Cairngorm Mountain Limited back in 2014, and we're expecting to be able to publish that and bring it to this committee in spring 2020.
So the questions that are arising from your conclusions in paragraph 22 will hopefully be answered in your follow-up.
That's our intention. What we've tried to highlight here is effectively the accounting treatment and the financial implications for 18-19 in this report, and we're doing the wider piece of work to answer those questions and to take account of the work that HI itself is currently doing to develop options for the longer-term future of the resort in the next report in spring 2020. Just
a random question. Paragraph 14 on page 6 of this report. The Highlands and Islands spent £250,000 on advice for legal and accountancy advice. Isn't that a lot of money for advice?
It is a significant amount of money, and we would expect HI to be taking proper legal advice, particularly in a circumstance like this. I'll ask Gordon to give you a bit more colour about what we've seen on this occasion.
Is it value for money?
I don't think we can answer that question yet, but we can give you a bit more information about what's been spent so far. Gordon.
Thank you. Yes, as the Auditor General says, this is a as we've already explored this one, is a complicated set of circumstances involving handover of administration of one company, handing over responsibility for the operations on the mountain to another company. So, as you'd expect, involvement of lawyers and accountants to help support the decision-making process round about there. As the Auditor General says, I think that's an appropriate thing to do. Whether the amount represents value for money is something that we'll look at and explore a bit further in terms of what's actually been expended there. But really just wanted to make the point that it is a complicated set of circumstances, untangling some of this as well, and HI looking at what options might be available to it in terms of looking at the circumstances that led to the administration of CML as it was at that time, and then the subsequent starting up of CMSL.
On the back of the need for that advice, the 2018-19 annual audit report recommends that HIE consider whether the finance team actually has the capacity and expertise to account for the complexity of these transactions that they're involved with, and whether any of these tasks that presumably are being outsourced could be brought in-house.
I'm not sure that's quite right, and again I'll ask Gordon as the auditor to unpick that for you a bit.
Yeah, that's right, Mr. Beattie. I mean, you're referring to our annual audit report, which accompanies the output from the year's audit work. And this is actually something that myself and the audit team there have been reporting on for the last couple of years, where we've wanted to highlight, as we've done in other organisations, the capacity expertise issues that are in finance departments. And I think we felt particularly important to refer to this last year and indeed again this year. And I think heightened this year by the very things that we've reflected, not only in relation to Cairngorm, but other challenges that HI faces. So really are trying to, as I say, highlight the fact that there are many things going on in HI's business world where there is a need for a good, strong finance department, and we're just making sure that we reflect that, we bring our judgment to bear on that. And I have to say as well, we've had some positive responses back from HI through its audit committee, wishing to pursue that to make sure they're as best placed as they can be to deal with the challenges of Cairngorm, or indeed the many other financial challenges we set out in the audit report.
Well, that indeed is my next logical question, is how they responded to those recommendations. Have they done anything about them?
As I said, we were pleased. I think Maggie and I were pleased when we were at the audit committee with the response we got from the audit committee at HI, who are taking up the recommendations and have been very active in getting assurances from officials that that action's been taken, and indeed have asked for the officials to come back and give a clear steer as to what they're actually going to do in response to our audit recommendations. So we're pleased that that's been taken forward in that way.
Again, just taking that to the next step, the Session 3 Committee's report asked Highlands and Islands to provide evidence to demonstrate that its current procedures and control systems produce dependable budget estimates And in the light of these significant findings in the 2018-19 audit report, are you satisfied that Highlands and Islands has procedures and control systems in place to produce dependable budget estimates?
So a report on the audit refers to our overall conclusions on the internal controls, and we believe that they are adequate for the preparation of the accounts.
Adequate or good?
They're adequate. They provide the safeguard over public money and
Okay, so that's accountants speak.
Controls processes for the production of the accounts. So we do conclude on that side of things, as you would expect us to do annually. And as you're reading from our annual audit report, there's quite a lot of information in there. In terms of the budget side of things, again, there are conclusions in there in our section on financial sustainability, which is one of the dimensions that we look at. And we highlight in that section of the report some of the substantial risks, challenges that High faces in terms of its finances. And just to be clear, it's not just us that are raising these things. High recognises that. And in our Section 22 report, which we're here to talk about today, we highlight a few sections in the annual report section of High's annual report and accounts, where it's writ large, if you like, in terms of the risk it sees and some of the conditions it's identified that need to take place in order to put its finances on a more sustainable footing, as it faces some fairly significant financial challenges.
I think there'll be more questions arising from this when the follow-up report comes forward.
Okay, I've got Bill Bowman, then Willie Coffey.
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about the conclusions in your report. In this, I think the second sentence you talk about it is important that HIE can demonstrate that its decision to transfer was robust, that it managed its relationship with CML well, decision making around the leading to the company's administration was robust and well founded. It seems this has happened some time ago. Has nobody asked them to see this already? I mean, is it something they're going to produce in the future, or they have done it already?
That refers to the audit work that we will be carrying out between now and next spring. We've had a look at some of those issues, and clearly it's information, records, documents that High will have, if they have them at all already. But we think that to answer them properly, we also need to go back and look at events in 2014 when CML was established, to look at the due diligence that was done at that stage, the quality of the business case that was in place, and the detail of the agreement between the two. You'll recognise that the audit of the financial statements is in itself a demanding period. So I took the judgment that we would produce a Section 22 report now with what's known at this stage, and then return next spring with a Section 23 report that covers the wider picture.
The way I read that was you have some doubt about whether they can.
I don't think that's our intention. It's my intention that we should be stepping back and looking at the whole picture in detail and with the proper audit evidence that we require to reach conclusions, recognising also, as I said, that High is still in the process of developing options about the future of the funicular railway and the way in which it will continue to be managed in future. It's to give you that big picture that I'm holding off.
The next sentence talks about while HIE's intention is to repair and reopen the railway, it is still not clear how much it will cost to do so, how it will be afforded, or what impact it will have on HIE's financial sustainability. Now, I take that as a very serious comment if it brings into doubt its sustainability, but you mentioned that the audit report was clear.
Yes.
You didn't mention that. Here you're, I think, giving quite a clear warning that there's something could threaten HIE.
I think I'll ask Gordon to come in a moment. I think you're probably sort of focusing in on the specific going concern judgment that the auditor is required to reach in relation to the annual reports and accounts, and we're comfortable about that given the status of High as a government body which receives government funding. Within its current budget, though, given what's currently known about the cost of rectifying, of making good the funicular railway and the impact on its financial position, that's one of the things we'll be looking at within the further piece of work.
But when you use the phrase on its financial sustainability, that to me suggests you're calling into question the actual ability of HIE to continue.
We know that during last year, because of the events around the funicular, High needed additional funding from the Scottish Government. That was over and above its normal grant to enable it to carry out its activities. We know that it's looking at the options both for bringing the funicular back into operation, into safe operation, and for the business model that might avoid the problems that we've seen over a long period now, over heading for 2 decades, being repeated in future. And it's that question of how the repairs can be carried out and a sustainable business model for the future reached that leads me to ask that question. I'm not prejudging the answer, but I think it's an important question.
Well, I can just conclude. I think we've had a discussion before about you've brought serious matters to the committee, like NHS Tayside, yet the accounts have been clear.
Yes.
But there's been very serious issues have arisen, but have not been mentioned in the auditor's opinion.
That's actually not quite the position. The financial statements have received a true and fair opinion, and I'll ask Gordon to talk you through the thinking behind that in a moment. And because I think there are significant issues here, I've taken the judgment to produce a report using my powers under Section 22 of the Public Finance and Accountability Act, which is what we're discussing this morning. And I'll use my Section 23 powers to answer the wider questions around that, which don't affect the audit opinion, but are significant in terms of the way public money is used in this body. Gordon, do you want to pick up the...
On the technical point, and just to be absolutely clear, so the requirement about going concern is for the management of the organisation to make that assessment, because it's the management who produce the accounts, and they have to decide whether the going concern basis is the proper basis on which to prepare the accounts. As auditor, I'm required to do work to confirm that that is indeed a valid assertion, and we do the work round about that as you'd expect to do as part of the audit. And in a public sector context, and I know there are many public sector organisations that are under financial pressure and challenges. Going concern is something that we look at, but of course it's an unusual thing for in that technical sense for it to become an issue, because in the case of High, for example, and public organisations generally, we can refer to the fact that Parliament's committed through the process and through government to finance and continue to finance them. And I think we have to separate that technical point and the clean conclusion that I made in my auditor's report in relation to the going concern basis of accounting from what we're trying to do in what we call our wider dimension public audit through our annual audit report, where financial sustainability is something that we believe that is right for us to make judgments on. And in the case of High's report, we've been very clear that there are a range of challenges and risks which High has to manage. And in fact, I think the report identifies 2 or 3 fairly substantial issues. And it's in that context that we wanted to play in the issues surrounding Cairngorm, because ultimately the kind of figures that we're talking about in terms of what it's cost so far and the prospect in future of repairing the funicular, these are big numbers in High's terms. High's about £100 million organisation, and as we say, the accounts this year contain a provision of near on £10 million for repair of the funicular. So I think it's right that we identify where there are risks to financial sustainability and make a judgment on the extent to which the organisation, in this case High, is preparing and dealing with these risks.
Okay, well, thank you. You just have to hunt for them, whereas the Auditor General brings us the report and makes it clear. Okay.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks, Jenny. It's basically on the same theme there as Bill. Is it a surprise to us that a funicular railway that's 20 years old needs to be maintained? Is there some issue about design here, or is there some issue about maintenance and who's responsible for that? Is there an argument about that? I mean, it seems to me that advice like that after 20 years is going to require maintenance and servicing and a cost. But why was that not built in at the initial stages of the project to provide for that? Has someone overlooked the possibility that it might need to be repaired at some stage in its life?
That's exactly the sort of question that we'll be looking to answer in the Section 23 report next spring. You're right, there absolutely should be provision in the agreement between High and the company that's operating the resort for maintenance. There should be mechanisms for making sure that those provisions are being monitored and that that investment is actually being made. We need to do the work to answer that to our satisfaction before we can report back to Parliament on it.
Is there a dispute about who actually owns it and is responsible to fix it?
The ownership of it's quite clear. Highlands and Islands Enterprise own the funicular, and within that there are questions that we need to look at in terms of the relationship between High as the owner of the assets and the operators, CML and now CMSL, in relation to the funicular. So, as the Auditor General says, these are the very central points that we want to consider as part of the further work.
There's no issue about design failures and things like that. It's purely a maintenance issue in the cost.
Yet that's part of the wider picture we're looking to answer.
Okay, thank you.
Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for allowing me to ask a couple of questions. As you know, I wrote to the committee regarding this subject last year, so I'm pleased that the Auditor General is looking at it. I just make an observation that 50% of the costs of building it seem to be the costs for repairing it, if you take High Isle's cost of £10 million. So, I mean, that's an amazing figure. I don't actually accept that figure. I think the cost will be much higher. So, building on a question earlier, as my experience as a surveyor, there's obligations between the landlord agent, which is HIE, and the tenant. Are you satisfied that £10 million worth of repairs to the funicular railway happened in the last year of Cairngorm Mountain Limited's operation of that, or do you feel that the landlord's agents failed to inspect the asset during the 5 years of operation? Because I don't believe £10 million worth of repairs happened in 2019.
Just clarify that the 9.6 million we refer to in the report is the provision in High's accounts at this stage. That means it reflects an uncertain amount, but I'll ask Gordon to talk you through what we know so far about that figure.
Yeah, and quite a lot of why we brought the Section 22 report is to unpick some and give some transparency around about quite a complicated position through High's accounts, as you would expect. The provision is there. It meets the requirements of the accounting rules in terms of how much has been set aside, if you like, through the accounts. But there are uncertainties exist around about that, as I think that you're alluding to. The more fundamental point of your question, I think, is something, and we have to go back to the point we made a couple of times. We need to explore further the nature of that relationship and what the expectations were in the agreement between High and CML in relation to the funicular in terms of its ongoing assessment of its what state of repair it's in and what was required to do to that. It's obviously going to be another central point that we want to look at.
Okay. Just to follow on from that, will you also be looking at the payments made by CML to natural assets for being a subtenant? Because it appears to me that money was being taken out of the asset, but no repairs were being carried out. And I'd like a handle of how much those payments actually are on an annual basis.
Again, it's the sort of issue that we're looking at as part of the work for the Section 23 report, the whole relationship between High and Nail, the owner of CML, the extent to which that was based on due diligence in the first place and then properly monitored during the life of the agreement until CML went into administration last autumn.
And Convener, if I could go just a wee bit further on that, is that it's impossible because it's commercially in confidence to see the contract between High and natural assets. But what I want to know is there, as there would be in all commercial contracts, an agreement regarding subtenancy and change of ownership? Because the ownership that ended up in 2019 was not where it started at in 2014. And I have severe doubts that due diligence was carried out. Will you be looking at that? Because I think we all know that natural assets was the only real person that was interested in this.
One of the benefits to the Parliament of having an Auditor General with the powers that I have is that I have access to contracts that aren't publicly available otherwise. I've said that we'll be looking at the due diligence that was done, the quality of the contract and the way that contract was managed during its life. We'll make note of the specific issues that you've raised and do our best to answer them as part of the work.
And my final question is that if there is, as I suspect there is, some dubiety about the way people have acted on behalf of actually the general public who own the asset, HIE hold the title, but they are just the agents for Scotland in relation to this. Will they be chased, and will you be advising that they chase back to the people who perhaps have taken money out of the assets and allowed it to crumble in front of their eyes?
my responsibilities are to report to Parliament on what we find in those areas, but we'll certainly be looking at issues of accountability and liability as far as we're able to do that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Convener, for allowing me to ask these questions.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. In 2009, there was a report done by this committee into this asset, and there was £26.75 million of public money had been spent at that point. Do you have any indication of how much public money has been spent up to this point at this stage?
We do, and so what we've tried through this Section 22 report, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, to highlight some of the important figures in there, in particular focusing on the balance sheet of High as at the 31st of March, linked to the assessment of sustainability. In terms of preparations for today, and just to highlight the figures, in 1819, overall we believe that the cost incurred by High was of the order of about £3.7 million. And broken down very briefly, if I can, Convener. Firstly, £1 million in relation to the snowmaking equipment we mentioned earlier, £2.4 million in relation to the setup and operation of CMSL, and finally, and I think this is quite helpful, and we mentioned this in the Section 22 report as well, there has been a cost associated for High in its officers dealing with all the issues that have unfolded, and that's about the order of about 0.3 million. We think it's quite good practice, actually, that High's been able to identify the cost that it's incurred with its people being involved in this. It's not a cost insofar as extra money's been spent, but it's time and cost that officials that High have been involved in the Cairngorm issue, which they've not been spending in terms of other operations of High.
But do you have a global figure? One assumes that the 2009 figure, 26 odd million, was the global figure up to that point. Do we have a global figure up to this point?
In terms of the overall project, no, we've looked at specifically in relation to the 18-19 accounts, and I say in the interests of helping when the accounts are laid in Parliament, for Parliament to understand the key elements in that account, in that set of accounts that relates to the Cairngorm Mountain and High's involvement in it.
One final thing from me. So there's obviously a lot of public money's gone into this, but is anyone quantifying the return on that investment? Because obviously there's investment in the actual asset, but then there's a much wider benefit of having an asset like that there. Is anyone quantifying the value of that extra return?
It's very much part of the business cases that we see that are starting to be brought forward, because you're right, it's not just about the cost of repairing funicularies and the like. There's obviously a much broader based issue which affects the local economy and jobs and the like, in tourism. So there's lots of different factors that are involved here, but these are the types of things that we'll expect to see when we do our additional work in terms of our job as auditors is to look at the basis on which some of these crucial decisions have been made, what information was available, the strength of that information, and whether the judgment is reasonable, the decision is reasonable based on the information that was available at that time. But these are all valid points that we'd look to consider as part of the wider work that we're now embarking on.
Thank you.
Okay, members have any further questions for our witnesses? Can I thank you very much indeed for your evidence this morning, and I'll close the public session of this meeting. Thank you.